I want to talk about a couple things related to the Sunday sermon about the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. So I got a lot of great feedback, very thankful for it. I love feedback. Please give me feedback if you have it. I'm going to try to respond to it today and hopefully more so in the future. If you want the context of this sermon, if you want to go listen to the sermon, you can listen to it on the YouTube page or on our website, sdpc.org. So now to the question at hand. There is a question about, what is the relationship between capitalism, usury, and why is this theft, right? What's the problem with this, right? And I want to illustrate the problem by basically drawing attention to the history of capitalism. So a lot of people think, because of a sociologist named Max Weber, that capitalism basically began with the Protestant Reformation. That's false. And he wrote a couple of essays. They became a book. I think it's something like the Capitalism and the Protestant Ethic, something like this, right? So that's kind of the basic principles is Protestant work ethic, and this gets translated into working hard and doing capitalism. It's a very actually nice and neat thesis, but it is false. And very obviously false because of the historical fact that capitalism predates Protestantism. So you cannot possibly explain the existence of capitalism through Protestantism. So capitalism began in the 12th to 15th centuries in northern Italy. So northern Italy, you had these great city-states up in places like Florence, Milan, Venice, and they were powerful. They were easily defensible. They were powerful for different reasons, but one of the things that they particularly did well was they traded in wool. They were the wool traders of Europe, and they decided they could make a lot more money if they got into textiles. And when I say they, I mean the businessmen of the city. So they built textile manufacturing plants. Basically, they got a lot of people employed. It was great. And then they decided they wanted to make a lot more money, and they got into banking. And at this time, that meant that you're going to loan money to different people, to poor, rich. You're going to make a lot more money probably off the rich, but you're going to loan money to the poor as well. And they were going to do it at compound interest, right? Usurious interest rates. So they were very, very successful at this. In the 1200s, there were 173 banks in northern Italy, different banks, and there were between the 1200s and the 1600s, every single bank in Western Europe was an Italian bank or a branch of an Italian bank. This is how successful these people were. It was fabulously successful. Well, it also led to moral degeneration almost immediately. In fact, Dante talks about this. Dante was the most famous citizen of Florence, which was the most arch-capitalist city in northern Italy. They had the most banks. He wasn't the most famous at the time. He just happened to be he actually became a political exile because of his participation in a rebellion. There were lots of rebellions. There was actually fairly consistent riots and stuff like this because there were problems with wages and stuff. And Dante wrote this great book called The Divine Comedy, and it's one of the great books of Western literature. And in The Divine Comedy, the first part is it's the Inferno. He goes into hell, and so he goes into these different levels of hell, and there's a particular level of hell, the 7th level of hell, where there are these two groups of people, and they're kind of all always organized by the sin they commit. And the two groups of people in this particular level of hell that are right next to each other are the sodomite and the usurer. And it's very interesting because he has a lot of compassion on the sodomites, the homosexuals. He weeps over the fact that they're suffering from these burning like meteorites almost on them, sulfur raining down from heaven, basically. He's very sad about this. He is not at all sad about the fate of the usurer. Now, the sodomites are interesting because what's happening is they dance around almost. They can't stand still. They're constantly in motion. And the usurer is the opposite. He doesn't move at all. The usurer sits and stares at a bag of money on his neck. And so Dante is pointing out, by putting these two people next to each other and by their particular punishments, that there is a symmetry in the crime of sodomy and usury. The sin of sodomy is that it takes something that is inherently fertile and it turns it sterile for the purposes of pleasure. Usury does the opposite. Usury takes something that is inherently sterile, money, which is a mere symbol of value, and it attempts to make it fertile for the purposes of personal pleasure. Now, why was Dante such an expert in this? Because sodomy erupted in Florence. No sooner did they begin the banking industry than they began to break the backs of the people, and the workers couldn't make a decent wage. And so, they immediately started having all the problems that we're having today. They stopped having families. The birth rates dropped to unreplaceable levels, and they turned to homosexuality and other forms of sexual deviancy. There's a great, enormous study of this period in Florence that says that many, if not most, of Florentine men were engaged in homosexual activity. That's a lot of people. The situation here was essentially that they got involved in this stuff because life was not working out for them. Now, this is a very important thing to recognize, that when you are broken down by systemic theft, it has a deleterious impact on the soul. And so you turn to other things that are also deleterious to the soul. You sort of are blunted in your understanding of who you are and what you were made to do. We see the exact same thing happening in England. The story is interesting. Henry VIII, I think he signs the Act of Supremacy in 1534 that makes himself the head of the church on earth in England. So he becomes the head of the church in England. And then 2 years later, he begins the looting of the monasteries. Now, the monasteries in England at this time owned somewhere between a quarter and a third of all of England. It's an enormous part of England, and Henry cannot wait to get his hands on that. Monasteries, they served a very important function. The English historian William Cobbett said you couldn't go 6 miles in any direction without bumping into a monastery, and when you got there, you get a free meal and a place to stay for the night for free. They basically made England safe, and they made England a place where you could be a not very rich person and you could make it. You could have a decent life, and this made them very beloved by the people. This is why they had so much land. It was donated to them. People loved the monasteries. Well, Henry VIII wanted their land and their money, and he started taking it in 1536, giving it to himself, of course, and the noblemen. And he finished, I think, taking it about 8 years later. And he's burning through the money, and all he's got left is land. Now, why does he burn through the money? Because he has no control over his appetites. Remember, this is the whole reason why he left the Church of Rome in the first place, is because he wants to get divorced, because he's very in love with Anne Boleyn, right? And he's sure that he can produce a male heir with Anne Boleyn, right? Well, that didn't last very long. And then he's got another wife, and then another wife, and then another wife. He had no control over himself sexually, no control over his eating appetite. By the end of his life, he had gotten so heavy that they had to develop a crane to lift the man onto his horse. And he also has no control over his spending. And he's involved in wars, and of course he's got this lavish lifestyle that he has to provide for. And so he blows through the money, and now what does he have? He's got land. And when you got land, well, you could sell, but he doesn't want to sell. He wants to borrow against the land. And so you got two different options at this point. You got the Italian banks, and you got the Jews. And the going rate of interest is about around 20% if you're a nobleman. They cut them a deal if you're a nobleman. You're a good, big customer. That's a huge amount of interest. So in 1545, Henry VIII legalizes usury. And this immediately created social chaos in England. And lots and lots of Englishmen wrote about this fact. I cited a guy on Sunday who wrote about it, Roger Fenton. He was the next generation. He was writing in 1612. He was a minister. He was one of the translators of the King James Version of the Bible. He said, God, nature, reason, all scripture, all law, all authors, all doctors of the church and philosophy, all councils of the church are against usury. This is true, historically. Philosophers, Greeks, Latins, lawyers, divines, Catholics, heretics, all tongues, all nations have thought usury as bad as a thief. And then, of course, in 1647, Westminster Larger Catechism places usury within the list of things that are forbidden by the Eighth Commandment, thou shalt not steal. So we have all these warnings about how bad this is going to be if a society embraces usury, and that it is going to destroy the social fabric of the society. And so the reason I bring this up is because I think it is very important to realize that many of the social ills in our society, we attribute them to the sexual revolution. But I think there's a really good argument to say that the sexual revolution itself, meaning mass, widespread sexual deviancy, is closely related and maybe downstream from the fact that we live in a usurious society. So one scholar who wrote a book, David Hawkes, wrote a book called The Culture of Usury in Renaissance England. He concludes the book by saying, the pornographic, commercialized sexuality of our world would have been understood by the people of a previous era as an entirely predictable consequence of our society's domination by usury. So, this raises a question. What do we do about this? Right? There's a systemic fabric of usury in our society. If you want to get an education, you're probably going to have to take a usurious loan. You want to buy a house. You want to get a credit card. This, of course, is why guys like Dave Ramsey are totally against credit cards, because they're going to enslave you, which they will if you ever don't pay them on time. But it's a lot deeper than this too. So this is a question that people asked, I think, after the church service on Sunday, and sadly, I don't know the answer to a lot of these things because I'm sort of thinking them out myself right now. And the reason I want to make this video and I want to talk some more about this is because I think it would be beneficial if other people would also continue this conversation and talk about how do we live justly with our money, our property. How do we do these things right? And I'll just point out that there are examples of people who have essentially decided that they are not going to operate on the system which we have inherited, but they're going to try to do justice by people. And so, like you've got things like there's something called the Mondragon Corporation in Spain. I don't know how you pronounce that, Mondragon. And this is a corporation that was started by a Catholic priest in 1954. They currently employ like 80,000 people. It's the 7th largest corporation in Spain. And they have operated on principles where they have tried to be as just as possible. They actually have specific limits to the wage differential between executives and regular employees. Everybody who's employed by the company also owns part of the company and votes on the future of the company. And this has had dramatic impacts on how they suffer through, I guess, storms of the economy. Like in the 80s, there was this massive recession in Spain. I guess maybe it was a depression. And there was about 25% unemployment throughout Spain. Well, the Mondragon corporation had a 1% unemployment because the people chose to take lower wages in order that everybody might stay employed. And they moved some people around, and some people took early retirement, things like this. But it wasn't like shoved on you. It was something that you decided to do because you cared about the future of everybody in the company. So my point is that when people get together and think about these things, they can come up with some really great ideas that they can put into action. And I hope that some of us who are smarter than me do something like that. But there are a lot of questions like, how do I invest my money? Right? I ask these questions myself. How do I, what should I own? Right? So I know that personally, I support abortions with my money. And I know this because my money is invested in the stock market and mutual funds, which are invested in companies which definitely promote abortion and which definitely give, authorize abortion to their employees. Right. I mean, I own stock in Alphabet, that's Google, and these people are totally for the sexual revolution, which means that as an owner of the company, a very small owner, I'm promoting that. My money is going toward that. Right. Now, this has caused me to reevaluate the situation. I haven't figured out what I'm going to do yet, but there are stock and mutual fund groups that specifically they want to go the moral route. But then there are bigger, so they're not going to promote abortion, right? They're not going to invest in anything that promotes abortion. But then there are bigger questions that have to do with our involvement in the stock market and what it means to own stock. So the way the stock market is set up, the corporations as they go public, the company has a responsibility primarily to the shareholder. That's the primary responsibility of the company. Now, the shareholder has zero responsibility to the people within the company or to the company itself. All I do is I own part of it and I sell part of it, and that's what happens, right? So that means that I cannot possibly take care of the property the way that God has designed that people are supposed to take care of property, which is a big problem. It means I could never walk into a company, even if I owned a decent part of it, unless I owned a controlling share. I could never walk in and say, "Hey, I really don't think that you're treating your people right. You got slave labor over here in China. All I can do is take my money somewhere else." And this is a massive problem. But like I said, I don't have the answer to these things. I think that it's important to draw attention to the fact that we live in and we operate within a system that is kind of designed to separate us and our money from the property that we own and from the people to whom we would naturally have responsibility. And so I'm going to leave it to you guys, and I hope this generates discussion about what to do about that. So that's all I got. But I pray that God would use it. So glory to him.